Right.
Okay, there we go. Hi everyone, and welcome again to yet another GaudiMaspes22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. I am your host, Larry Chapp. Most of you know that. A couple of housekeeping things. Once again, just a gentle reminder because I'm not a grifter, I'm not a clickbait artist, but we do have a fundraiser thing going. And I want to remind people that one of the main things we're doing for the fundraisers, we are opening up a food bank, food pantry near 1 block away from our parish in Scranton, Pennsylvania, St. Thomas More. It's associated with the Providence Crisis Pregnancy Center, which is a pro-life pregnancy center, and it's a big deal. It's a huge deal in this neighborhood, one of the poorest neighborhoods in Pennsylvania. So whatever you can do to help us out, that would be great. The other thing is, I know I keep promising people my next issue of my Hermeneutics of Kenosis article. And all I can say is that doing these podcasts takes a lot of time, right? And every time I turn around, I'm doing a podcast. And so I am working on the hermeneutics of kenosis. It will get done. It's just going to take some time, maybe a few more days, maybe a week. I know I keep promising it, but it will be there. It will happen. Just patience, patience, patience. Anyway, I'm very excited today. First off, just last week I did a podcast with Kale Zelden, who teaches at Portsmouth Abbey up in Rhode Island and teacher of English there. And people, Kale, I always get 10 million emails from people saying, "Oh my God, we love your podcast with
Mm.
Kale." One of those emails came from another repeat customer on the show, Christopher Altieri, who is himself a teacher at a prep school, okay, at
Right.
Fairfield Prep, his alma mater up in Connecticut, which is, of course, Jesuit. So yeah,
Alas.
yeah,
Yeah.
we won't hold that. But Chris is a former employee at Vatican Radio. He's got a PhD in political philosophy. He is a great journalist. He used to be my editor at the Catholic Herald. He also writes frequently for Catholic World Report. He is just one of those freelance writers that everybody loves to read. He's very good at the Rome beat, the Rome thing. And there you go. So I'm going to begin, and Kale, you can jump in anytime.
Yep.
Feel free, my friend. There's no formalities. Oh, first off, hey, welcome, Chris. Welcome, Kale.
Good to see you, man.
Good to be here, Larry. Thanks a
Yep.
lot, and thanks for
Yep.
doing this. Yeah, I say I fairly grubbed the invitation onto the show this time. I think that we ought to acknowledge that it's the
I
elephant in
Yeah,
the
I
room right
wasn't going to
now.
mention that. I wasn't going to say I got this
Well, I did it out in
wonderful,
public. I mean, it was
wonderful
on the
private Facebook message from. Actually, Chris set up a
No, I think I
group.
did it in public, and then I sent you guys
Oh
a
yeah,
private
That's
first
right.
on
message.
the
That's
web
right.
on the Facebook page, and then you set up
Yeah.
this private.
What about me?
Yeah, come on, guys. Can I play too? All right. And of course, we're happy to have you come along, Chris. Always great to have you on the show. And so, one of the things Kale suggested, and I agree with it 100%, and we're going to get into some other things as well. But we're both kind of, and you do mention it in some of your books, but we're both dying to hear some of your Vatican stories. You can't obviously break confidences. You can't obviously be uncharitable. You don't want to drag people. You don't want to engage in the sin of detraction or any of those, all those caveats. But are there things that you can tell us that I think actually would be pertinent to the average Catholic, kind of having a better understanding of how does this organization that we call the Vatican work? And maybe you have some anecdotes and stories that can highlight how this institution works. So take it away, Don Pardo. No, Chris Altieri. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing that I would do is sort of challenge the premise, right? Which is that it works. And I,
Oh, I don't want to interrupt, but what's that famous joke when the reporter asked John the 23rd, how many people work
how
in the
many people work at
Vatican?
the Vatican? He says about half.
Yeah, yeah.
That cuts, and it's. I think that uh, he was a wit, right? And I'm sure that he spoke with his tongue fairly firmly ensconced in his cheek, and I can speak, and I've written about this too, that, this is maybe a good place to start in the answer to your question, because people
Okay.
have the idea of the Vatican being a sort of a 3D, live action Renaissance tapestry.
Yeah, yeah,
That's a good way to describe it.
Or medieval tapestry or Renaissance portrait, and it's not. It's a bunch of guys with office jobs. Okay, so let's start with demystification.
yeah. So
It's
like
a
on that,
whatever, and I say this all the time. Whatever else it is a bureaucracy.
right,
It
right.
looks, sounds, acts, and smells exactly like a bureaucracy.
And you might even argue, Chris, and please argue back if I'm wrong, but I mean, it might be the oldest bureaucracy we have. I mean, it might have even been the institution that created bureaucracy.
Uh, that may be somewhat of a tall order, but
Yeah,
not exactly wrong, certainly in the spirit in which you say it.
yeah,
One way that I've put it is that the Roman Curia is neither more nor less than a very old, very large chancery. And
right,
anyone who's been around a chancery knows what that means.
right.
Um,
Well, assume for the sake of, you and Larry do actually have experience precisely with that kind of setup, the chancery setup. I mean, for those of us who show up on Sundays and holy days and do our duties, I'm not so sure that folks know what you mean by that, Chris.
uh,
Well, I'm going to say this, and then Chris can answer.
Yeah, yeah,
My wife used to work for a chancery, and I've been familiar with a few. My experience of people who work in chanceries is that most of it are lay people, most of them are underpaid, and most of them are unhappy.
yeah.
That's my experience. Back to you, Chris.
yeah, think the ecclesiastical DMV circa 1982.
Wow,
Um,
wow, wow.
and look, there are lots of reasons for which that is the case, and not all of them are bad. Some of them are intractable, and some of them
Uh-huh,
aren't.
uh-huh.
And the Roman Curia has been around ever since Peter looked over one of his shoulders and said, "Somebody take a letter,"
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
in some form, or that was the beginning of the Roman Curia.
yeah,
Okay. So that's 2000 years going.
yeah.
Practices, habits, uh, praxis, to say it in Greek. Um,
So the Gospel of Mark is the first product of the CDF.
Slightly anachronistic, but
Yeah, yeah, a little bit, just a little bit.
yeah.
Yeah, but that's
Um,
your point, though, is well taken, right? That
y-
okay.
you know,
Let's go ahead.
there and I sort of think, I hate to speak in such sweeping either in sweeping generalities or in commonplaces and platitudes, but sometimes they're useful. You're all familiar with G.K. Chesterton's line about taking down a fence. If you know why the guy who put it up, go ahead and think about taking it down. If you
Yeah,
don't know why it's there, don't move it.
yeah,
um which is the case of in the reform of any institution, that consciousness, awareness of that principle is absolutely necessary to anyone who would succeed. Really, absolutely necessary for anyone who wouldn't make a complete bollocks
yeah,
a dog's breakfast of the project.
uh-huh,
Um, it's one of the things that I pointed out in reporting and analysis of Francis's reform of the Curia, right? That you know, whatever else it is, it's a bureaucracy, and Reforming a bureaucracy is one thing. Reforming bureaucrats is an entirely different project. And the other thing to be aware of is that, and this is where we started, the people who work in the bureaucracy are very often highly competent, dedicated, true believers in the mission and in the work, who are, overworked, underpaid, very much put upon, and do the best in very trying circumstances. That's
Yeah.
that's a fact. So anything I say about the organization, I hope isn't mistaken for a criticism of the people who are actually doing the work. And there's the other thing that, what's done badly may have been done worse were it done by others.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
All of that is the case. But
Kale?
bad
Yeah.
is bad.
Yeah. So I mean, I would imagine then, there's a sort of a haunting almost of the activity that you're occupying spaces and doing things and trying to keep things in place and move things around and reform. You're always doing it with a legacy that's almost impossible to sort of properly conceive. And so I would imagine that in the spirit of Chesterton's fence, as you bring up, that almost any kind of action is going to bring with it unexpected consequences, even for the most prudent and for the most temperamental and the most temperate, I should say. And yet, so are you arguing then, Chris, that in part the mess, perhaps I think the three of us would agree that we get a real sense of mess. The mess actually could be worse.
You read deeply enough in history with close enough attention, Kale, as well, and you know this as well as I do. It can always be worse.
And has been, probably.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I want to hold off on that. I want to hold off.
Yeah, maybe.
And I don't want to put Chris on the spot with that. But again, if I'm being sort of parachuted into this conversation between, Larry, the theologian, and Chris, the sort of the on the scene guy who's had real experience with the bureaucracy, right? So Chris, you often talk about in your writing about the sort of the governance crisis of that we find ourselves in the moment. And Larry, I got to know you through, I feel like a real, you really sort of put your finger on the kind of theological crisis that is being sort of pushed to the fore. And I'm fascinated with the way in which both of you have sort of working in sort of two seemingly different spheres, are working towards some kind of convergence. And so as a non-theologian and a non watcher of the bureaucracy, I'm interested to hear how each of you think your respective works have begun to dovetail.
Who do you want to go first?
Well,
Larry, why don't you jump in? Larry, why don't you jump in?
I'll jump in, but we still haven't gotten to any juicy anecdotes from Chris Altieri here in terms of the Vatican.
Well,
but maybe
I mean, I could tell you a little bit about process.
Boring. We don't want to hear about process. I want to know.
Well, but all right, you don't want to hear about process. I won't talk about process, but I think you're missing out. You want to hear
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm just setting you up because
you're winding me up, Larry. And it's working.
I'm trying to set up some sort of platform for you to share salacious and juicy details with us. But I get this powerful sense that that's not going to happen. But before we get to Kale's very good question, I do want to complete your discussion. It's a bureaucracy, yes, and there are processes associated with all bureaucracies that are probably fairly universal. But I have two questions with regard to the bureaucracy before we get to this convergence, and I think it's important that Kale's bringing up. The first question is the Curial bureaucracy in the Vatican overwhelmingly clerical? which would make it different from, I think, a lot of chancery offices where it's like almost a
Right.
50-50
Right.
split between clerical and lay employees. That'd be the first question. And then the second question would be, are there things unique to this bureaucracy? Because after all, it is the Holy See,
Right.
all right, and not just, some office at Home Depot in their corporate headquarters. It's got to be, there have to be idiosyncratic elements to the Vatican bureaucracy. So maybe you could,
Sure. Yeah,
go
drilling
ahead.
down on that, first of all, the Vatican doesn't exist except as a sort of journalistic
Right.
shorthand. Okay,
Right.
you have you're quite right to point out that you have the Holy See and you have the Vatican City State. Now, under
Yeah,
Francis, the governments and administrations and the powers and the competences of those two very distinct and very different juridical persons and realities have been blurred according to observers in the know, with the baleful effects in the present and potentially in the future on both. The Holy See is the sovereign subject of international law through which the apostolic see, the Pope, uh, engages with other countries, with the international community, right? Um, the Vatican City State is the territory he governs, that has its own government, its own administration, its own offices, its own
yeah.
facilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When we talk about the Vatican, it's it's little more than journalistic shorthand, and very often, the people who are using it, uh, especially if they're uh, not insiders, uh, don't quite know what they're talking about, not to put too fine a point on it. And that's
Well, the
that's
Vatican
important.
itself refers to
Um,
itself as the Vatican News. It's part of what's. Oh. Looks like we've frozen here a little bit. At least,
that made sense because it was the official state broadcaster uh, of the Vatican City State, but was semi-official with respect to the Holy See.
yeah.
We occasionally had to ask forgiveness of the Secretariat of State, but never. We're set up in a way that meant we didn't always have to ask for permission, and that was one very much Jesuitical, in the best sense of that term. It was a work of the Society of Jesus from the beginning, and very useful to people who knew how to use it in that very Italian sort of ambiguous space with a good bit of wiggle room, right?
Very
Uh,
interesting. Is it mostly clerical?
Cardinal Casper was a guy who knew how to operate in that liminal space very effectively, and there have been
Right.
a few others in recent years and decades. Of course,
I
it's
once,
all gone now because
Right.
Vatican Radio is a brand name operated through the
yeah,
dicastery, what they call the dicastery for communications now,
yeah.
which
Everything's a
is
dicastery.
exactly nobody's favorite outfit these days. But there you have it.
Yeah.
Everything I
Pure,
say about that should be taken with a grain of salt, folks, because I used to work for the thing that used to be called Vatican Radio, and well, if you want to know what I think about it and what they've done, just you know, Google what I've
Google
had
it.
to say
Yeah.
about it.
yeah,
Get
Google,
into
which
it
is
now.
a complete tangent. I once shared a limo ride to the airport with Cardinal Casper. Rodney Hauser and I did, and it was right before JP2 died. And for whatever reason, the name Hans Kung came up, and I asked Cardinal Casper, what was Kung's problem? What was Hans Kung's? He goes, the problem with Hans Kung is he became Hans Kung. Right? In other words, he became this role that he was playing. He
Yeah.
became this
Yeah.
larger than life thing that took on a life all its own. Then the other thing was, I said, I think it was Rodney said to Cardinal Cal, who do you think is going to be the next Pope? And then I quickly interjected, maybe it's going to be you. meaning cardinal, and he threw up his arms and he says, "Yeah, maybe, could be." I thought that was, he didn't say, "Oh, forget about it. I don't even want the job. Who would take that job?" No, yeah, maybe I could be. Very interesting. But he was a very gracious guy. He had just given a talk in my diocese. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I want to come back to the Vatican and how then is the Vatican bureaucracy different from, let's get that, different from just the sort of corporate bureaucracy that you might find in any office, in any business someplace.
Well, it will certainly be different from bureaucracies as they are found in large American corporate spaces.
Yeah.
In that
Government bureaucracies are probably a better analogy rather than.
they may be a better analogy, but even there, the similarities are stark as well. There is Vatican bureaucracy, using the shorthand, right? Curial bureaucracy tends to be very much top down. Um, they're not consultative. And when
Right.
there are consultations, they tend to be of the box ticking variety. Um,
Yeah.
they are not uh, meritocratic. In fact, it's fair to say that one of the complaints that workers have had through years and decades is that initiative is uh, discouraged and occasionally punished, right?
So yeah, so that's fascinating to me. So then how do things kind of bubble up from the ooze then? How does, an action or a promulgation or a promulgate, how does something like that bubble up from the ooze if all of the pressures seem to work against initiative, work against consultation, against these things that I think the three of us would consider in any other kind of space normal.
uh People who are very smart and who are very careful in how they go about their work within the system do work within the system, sometimes to make things uh pretty good, and sometimes to limit the damage on things that are coming down from the top, right?
Well,
And
Yeah.
sometimes it's impossible.
I mean, in other words,
I,
is it reactive?
I
Is it
mean,
is it is it strategic? Like I'm having a hard sense of, because from America's
well, it
standpoint,
depends on
again,
what it is. I mean, I
okay,
remember, in what was it, 2000, was it 2009 that the Williamson fiasco happened? And we at Vatican Radio didn't know it was in the pipeline until the day it was announced, and uh, we would have told you who the guy was and
right,
put it on your radar, but nobody asked,
right.
you know.
Well, that
Uh,
that raises not just the question of competence. It also raises the issue of maybe they didn't ask because they couldn't stand you. And my point about that is, isn't there competition between the various congregation dicasteries? Don't they hate each other's guts? It just seems that way sometimes. For example, what was it last year? The Argentinian priest that had been laicized or something, and then the Secretary of State comes
Ah,
out and says,
yes.
Secretary of State comes out and says,
oh
"Oh yeah, that's rescinded. He's back being a priest." And then the dude who runs the congregation for clergy says, "Oh no, yet. He is still laicized. Who the hell are you to
no,
tell?"
hold on a second. Hold on a second. That was no, it wasn't clergy that was involved in that, to the best of my recollection, Larry. That
I
was
don't know. I'm just juicing
um
the wheels, greasing the wheels here. Come on. I,
well,
I
but
I'm going to see
that
if there's
happened.
any.
I wasn't there for it, and it's one of the reasons that I sort of chafe when these things break, because I as much as I do like teaching, and believe that I'm doing God's work here.
Yeah.
Being in the mix and being in the chase is something that
Well,
I
was
miss.
it the
Also, because I think
DDF
it would
that
have done.
pushed back?
It was Archbishop John Kennedy, who was the head of the discipline section, who pushed back. But that was really an extraordinary thing,
Yeah.
shocking, frankly, that uh, the Secretariat of State, in the person of the Sostituto, basically the papal chief of staff, should attempt to vacate the decision of an ordinary Roman tribunal. Uh, was just flabbergasting. And we still haven't got to the bottom of it.
No, we
Boy,
haven't.
I would love to, but don't have a masthead behind me right now. You give me, you give me 3 months and unlimited resources, and I'll get anything for you.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what the Pope had for breakfast
Right.
every day. But unfortunately, unfortunately, that it's not on the cards just now. But I can tell you that that story stinks to high heaven.
Okay, so again, as the lay guy here, and I mean lay, not in the all of us are laymen, but
Sure.
the lay guy who's neither a theologian nor a kind of an insider type who's worked this beat. Why? I mean, I remember you being struck by that story. You were like, "This is a big deal. Pay attention to this one." Okay, so I'm asking you, as the guy who doesn't know anything, why? What was the stink there?
Basically, that an organ that, which is the Secretariat of State, uh, which has no competence over matters of trial, justice at trial, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, intervenes to vacate the ordinary judicial judgment against a guy who had been accused, tried, and convicted of some very bad things. That it happened uh, in favor of a fellow who was a priest in the Pope's home country. It doesn't make the thing less suspicious.
That's for
You know,
sure. I would want to
and
know is did the Pope have a hand in this? That's what I want to know.
well, it is somewhat lacking in verisimilitude that he wasn't at least briefed on it. Whether it was before or after the fact, who knows? And that's part of the problem here. It is a world in the nutshell illustration of the broad and general problems with transparency that the whole system of ecclesiastical justice has. You look and continues to have and will continue to have. The confidence of the faithful in the ability of the church to deliver justice
Right.
is uh, it would be maudlin and criminal for any member of the faithful these days to trust the organization tasked with it to deliver the justice that it is supposed to deliver in the name of the whole people of God. Now that's you ask me, that's a story.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, because and it's also, I would just again say that's a story that cuts, at least part of the crisis of unbelief that Larry talks about, right?
Yes.
So you're talking. So again, this is Christopher, you're talking about a sort of a question of governance. People sort of acting outside of their lane, they don't have standing or whatever it may be, kind of flexing their sort of raw positional power, which is exactly kind of to Larry's point, or a point that Larry often makes, which is it appears that the people who are in charge don't understand that people are watching what they do and are ignoring what they say, because you would be a fool to pay attention to their words, the trust me, the trust me, the trust me, and not pay attention to the loud, wordless actions that they are doing in front of that. And so that's corruption, right? That deflates our sense of the seriousness of the entire endeavor, the missional point of the whole church. And it doesn't seem to me like these fellows who populate the bureaucracy, who man the levers, work those desks, as you said earlier, have any concept that there are genuine ramifications amongst the faithful. However far down you trickle down, to get to my level, like this stuff matters in a way that they don't appear to appreciate.
I think that's fair, and I think it's right as far as it goes. But you have guys though, like Archbishop Kennedy, right, whose record of service and leadership are as amenable to scrutiny and to criticism as anyone else's, but he did stand up, right, and he
Right.
did push back,
He did.
right, and that's not nothing. I'd also mention that, he is in charge of a tribunal that is either directly or indirectly responsible for overseeing criminal justice for the worst crimes at canon law. Uh,
Like Rupnik's.
it like Rupnik's. We'll get to that.
Oh yeah.
His office has a worldwide billet, right? For an organization that has well over 1 billion members. And the whole budget of the CDF is a few million, not just his department, is a few million euro a year. He's got, fewer than 24 people working full time for him, or he did the last time I checked. But even if he does have 24 full-time staffers now, that's fewer people than work in, a rural state's attorney's office.
Right. Or even a U.S. senator's office. A
You
U.S.
know,
senator doesn't have that big. So.
If you want to know how seriously the church at the highest levels of governance really does take the problem of justice, that on its own should tell you a good deal, right? Um, and I've had people from other dicasteries, when I've been looking into all sorts of stories involving abuse, corruption, cover-up, malfeasance, incompetence, and all of the above. One of the tough things is when you're on this beat trying to figure out which is which. And my approach, by the way, is usually to say, I'm not. It's not my job to say, who's a rotter, who's corrupt, who's this, who's that. My job is to say what happened and
Yeah.
let the people who are reading make up their minds, but give them wherewithal to form judgments. That's what informing the public is always meant to me. But I've had guys say to me, "Look, we are not a bureau of investigation," and they're not wrong, right? But at some point, we're not a bureau of investigation. If that's the answer you're getting from everybody,
Right.
then nobody's minding the store.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So, um, my question then is this, in terms of, okay, using this one little anecdote about this priest from Argentina who is accused of sexual abuse, credibly, and then, gets removed from the clerical state only to have
Right.
that sort of overturned by the Secretary of State and then gets pushed back on again. What would make the Secretary of State think that he not only had the power to do that, but should do that. And the reason why I ask is this. I mean, I'm imagining a scenario, and you can tell me, Chris, if I'm full of crap or whether I'm imagining a scenario where the Secretary of State sits down and has a private audience with the Pope.
Well,
And
it was not the Secretary of State, it was the Sostituto.
oh, the Statute. That okay. That's an
And
important. Yeah. No, go ahead.
you can we know that you can imagine quite a bit, Larry. I um I'll tell you what.
Yeah.
When I get in the room with Archbishop Peñapara, I will ask him, but I'm not going to speculate.
Okay, but the only thing what I was going to say is this that you know because this is how human beings work. So he goes in, he has a conversation with the Pope. They're talking about this case, and Paris says to the Pope, you know, there are some mitigating circumstances here. After all, I mean, blah blah blah. Maybe we should look at this again. And the Pope says, yeah, you know, maybe something we should look at again, something like that. And so he leaves the room and says, okay, the Pope just gave me permission to turn this whole thing around. You know, in other words, because this is the way power works. You know, you finally get access to the big dude, to El Jefe, to the numero uno. And I imagine it'd be like some lowling who finally gets access to see. Of course, the Sostituto is no lowling, but you get my point. He finally gets access to the Oval Office. Finally has the president's ear. Finally makes it past the chief of staff, although he is the chief of staff. All right, and you get my point that okay, I've got a little nugget here, and I'm going to run with it. And so what I'm wondering, this particular case notwithstanding, my deeper question is, what makes the Apostolic See, the Holy See, and the governance of the Vatican City State, what makes it bureaucratically different from other governmental sorts of bureaucracies? I would have to think that if your bureaucracy has as its head uh, somebody who has the universal jurisdictional authority over the entire church that the Pope has, one would think that the bureaucracy operates in a fashion that revolves around access to that man, access to that authority, and then uses that access to leverage something politically in one's competition with other dicasteries. Am I full of crap?
No, not precisely, but I don't think that those are the counter distinguishing features of the Vatican
Okay.
bureaucracy.
Okay, go ahead. That's why I asked the question.
That's the case in bureaucracy wherever it's going to be found. Now, bureaucracies are they tend to be siloed. They tend to compete for resources. They tend to compete for access and all of that. You're quite right. I think you're illustrating with your point that the similarities rather than the differences.
Okay. Yeah, I guess so.
But the Vatican's is these days especially a highly dysfunctional bureaucracy, in part because Francis has largely ruled without it. And so that the primary objective of anyone in a position of power in any department, in any dicastery these days is, stay out of the eye of Sauron, if I could put it that way, right? To avoid
Yeah.
garnering the attention of the head man, and certainly one of the ways to do that is to avoid embarrassing him. Now, if all you're ever trying to do is avoid a mistake, the paradox is that you're more likely to screw up, and the best way not to embarrass the head man is just to not do anything, right?
I feel like there's a parable.
Of,
I feel like there's a parable about this somewhere.
there happens to be. I think I know the one you're thinking
I
of.
may have read it.
There's
I don't know.
There's a fellow about there's servants and talents somewhere.
Yeah.
That's the one.
I heard you were an irrational taskmaster, so I kind of hid from you.
That's right. Oh my goodness.
but that particular landowner wasn't always around, looking over shoulders and breathing down people's
Yes.
necks.
Yes.
And sometimes it's happened that Francis has given his instructions to people and they followed them to the letter because any deviation is not smiled upon,
Mhm.
and things don't go the way he wants, and he'll blame the underling for that. That sort of thing has happened with a fair degree of frequency, I think, in the past dozen years. Um, and the Curial lifers have largely all gone to ground. I think everyone's waiting to see what's going to happen under the next guy.
Are we at that point officially, you
Because
think?
oh, I think we've been at that point for
Yeah.
years. We
Yeah,
were
me
at
too.
that point before I left.
Okay. Okay.
Uh, you know, and you asked about the lay involvement at the in the Curia and in the Vatican. Recently, there have been rumblings of significant discontent. Now, these have, popped up time and time again over the years, but there's some fairly significant agitation. John Allen at Crux has done a great job reporting on it. I wouldn't fall out of my chair to see more from him, from others, from that story. One of the things that uh, is also a good thing to do if you're on the beat is to continue to cultivate Italian contacts, and to I used to talk with people all the time, and talk with porters and things and buildings,
Yeah.
haunt the cafes around the Borgo and stuff like that, because that's what, that's where you pick things up. Um,
And the cafes on the Borgo are overrated as eateries, so it's about the only reason you would have for going to a restaurant on the Borgo, if you ask me.
Da Roberto is lovely, I think, and he's not paying me to say that, so there you go. But
Been there, yes.
um, there are there's much to be gleaned from the Italian dailies too, if you know what to look for, and to a certain extent, it reminds me of that scene in what was the movie with Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith.
Men in
The Men in
Black.
Black, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he says, "Oh, we got to check the hot sheets," and he goes
Yeah.
and he grabs the National Enquirer from the supermarket stand.
Yeah. That's great.
Uh, you know, um, uh, you got to know how to borrow from another parable. Just you need to know how to separate the wheat from the chaff, but there's plenty of both. There's not just the one.
Yeah.
But doing that as much, and I try to do as much of it as I can, it doesn't, it still puts me a day behind, at the very least. And, if the stories are well reported, it's weeks behind. And it is no real substitute for being on the ground. So, forgive me for speaking in sort of, impressionistic modes here, but it's safer for everybody.
Yeah, that's fine. But you said something interesting. Excuse me, my voice is giving out, but and I'll turn it over to Kale again here in a second. You said something interesting, which is, the Pope has largely, this Pope, Pope Francis, sort of ruled by not through the Curia, but kind of like through bypassing the Curia. Now, let me play devil's advocate here in Pope Francis's defense. I don't think, let's say, for example, Pope Benedict, maybe he tried to rule the church through the Curia more than Pope Francis has. Well, where did that get Pope Benedict? Stabbed in the back, with Vati leaks and so on. And probably one of the main reasons why he quit the job was he just didn't feel up to the task of dealing with this worldwide church via this dysfunctional pile of garbage called the Curia. And so Pope Francis comes in and says, "Bust, I'm going to buy, and they're not going to do to me what they did to Benedict. And so I'm going to surround myself with a small circle of advisors and to hell with the Curia. And I'm going to try and now that's putting a happy face on it. In other words, that's putting, like I said, plain devil's advocate.
I
So maybe you could run with that as a comment. Is that accurate, inaccurate? Are there other reasons why this Pope doesn't like to rule through the Curia? So go ahead, Chris.
uh well, you're um absolutely. Um and that sounds like me circa 2017. I think I was saying that or things like it.
Hmm.
You know, before I had even you know, done my final broadcast at Vatican Radio. Um, Francis is certainly at the beginning was content to govern without the benefit of the Curia, largely for the reasons that you said, and that on its own, you know, it's a choice that has a downside, but was eminently reasonable. Um, I don't think that we can see that as uh, a temporary measure taken in response to, you know, force majeure or exigent circumstances at this point. It is
Yeah, yeah,
clearly his modus governandi, and arises out of questions of experience, personality, and formation. You know, I've for good and for ill, he is a Jesuit and a formed man, and I say that as a fellow who is uh, as much a spiritual son as of Ignatius as anyone can be without having S.J. for a last name.
but I'll stop you there if you
I love those men, and I love the society, and
well,
am grateful to heaven for them every day. Okay.
those men in
But,
that society in Argentina hated Bergoglio when he was their superior in Argentina,
well, being the
right?
boss is not a popularity contest.
Well, my
I'm
point
not
though
gonna.
is to go to to link that then with your insight with regard to Francis doesn't rule through the Curia. And at this point, it goes beyond simply not trusting the Curia. They're not going to do to me what you did to Benedict. Now it's indicative of a general personality type. This is how he governs. And so then you translate that back into when he was superior down of the Jesuits in Argentina. And he was not at all popular with his Jesuits down. Now, the reason, okay, so the question then naturally arises. He wasn't popular there, and he's not popular now, all right, in Rome with the Curia.
Right.
So when do we start simply saying he's a lousy boss, okay, and is not good at governing? At what point do we say that?
Uh, 7 or 8 years ago, if you're reading my copy, 10 years ago,
Yes.
I'm not sure how. You
See,
know,
I'm
I
setting
mean,
you up, Chris. Come on. I just threw a slow pitch right over the
uh,
plate.
but and I'm gonna. Uh, I want to see if I can get this right, but I don't want to do it from memory. So
Yeah.
it's
I'm going to make you regret coming on here. That's my goal here
That's the
today.
goal, man. You thought you got us on here. We got you on here.
um look, uh there is so much to be said for let me put it this way, all right? um and I'll see about pulling it up because I want to get it right, and not just because I want to quote myself, but I don't want to gloss myself. Um, Ignatius wanted his men to be at once stalwart Pope's men
Right.
and also utterly fearless theological and pastoral envelope pushers who were going to go to places in the world where they had to be able to show initiative and act on their own, and also be utterly committed to obedience to the Petrine See. Now that tension in their existence, a real spiritual tension, needs to be productively managed. And I think that in the main, throughout the 500 years, it has been. Yes, Francis has been more interested in governing by force of personality than by any other means. And, back in, 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, even 18, that was fine and even necessary. You look back to skip all the way back to the last years of the reign of Pope St. John Paul II, who was physically weak. He was sick. He was
Right.
not capable of governing the church day to day. All right. And when cats away, mice will play, right? The dancing mice of the Curia in those years, well, they kept up that dysfunctional ball, right?
Right.
And they did it all the way through the reign of Benedict XVI, who never wanted the job and never really had his heart in the governing part of it, and acknowledged in his own memoir, Milestones in English, that administration has always been a weakness of his. He's never been good at it. He's never liked it. He's never had any aptitude for it.
Not only that, he hates bureaucracy.
And his whole pontificate was
Yeah.
marked by the turmoil that got us a conclave with an appetite for reform in the first place. Right? 2017 was, I put it this way, years and years ago, a year in which the micro fissures in the structure of the Curia began to be visible to the naked eye. All right.
What are you using 2017 as what precipitating event are you using here?
That was the year in which Francis began to roll out his curial reform sort of piecemeal.
Okay.
It was also the year in which he fired Mueller,
Right.
or didn't renew Mueller's mandate. And there was a backstory to that, which has come out recently as well.
Yeah.
There were lots of reasons to look to 2017 as the year in which things began to crack. What I would say, though, is that, and remember, it was in December of 2016 that Francis gave a big speech on the reform of the Curia.
Yeah. Right.
And sort of laid out his program, right? So we had mile markers and things by which to measure in 2017 that we hadn't that we hadn't had until then. Um, you know,
Yeah, one of the things that
the
he changed.
Society of Jesus has never, for one single hour of a single day since the promulgation of Regimini Militantis Ecclesiae, that was the founding document, right?
Yeah.
They've never had an unproblematic relationship with the church's hierarchical leadership. And the whole Jesuit charism has been ordered and is ordered to the right management in the company and in the souls of its members of the tension that arises instantly and inevitably when those two poles that I was talking about earlier are activated, right? Um,
Yeah.
when you put a Jesuit at the head of the hierarchical leadership of the church, you risk either collapsing that tension or exploding it. And that's, I think, one of the major reasons that we haven't had a Jesuit pope until now, right? It's not like, Robert Bellarmine wasn't the smartest guy in the room.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
You know,
Hopefully we will never have another Jesuit pope.
and look,
I mean, this one's been a complete catastrophe as far as I'm concerned.
as a governor, I don't disagree, but history, is and
Well,
we think in
he
centuries, but
seems
we call them we call them how we see them, and we take the hits as they come. And I'm not going to disagree with you on the point.
so. What's the difference between a dicastery and a congregation? Because that was one of the curial reforms that he introduced, and I've never quite understood.
Well,
Everything became a dicastery. What the hell's a dicastery, Chris?
a dicastery is just a highfalutin Greek root term for uh court or department, right? We've always used
Right.
it as a sort of shorthand. The old distinction under the system that's been in place for hundreds of years has been between congregations, which have governing power and authority of their own, right, written into their statutes, and councils, which are merely consultative bodies, right? Pontifical councils have
Okay,
have
right.
a
So my point
consultative role, but
that
the congregation for the doctrine of the faith, or the congregation for clergy, has governing authority on it, on their own. Now everything they do is always in the name of the Pope. That's axiomatic.
Yeah.
uh
so in other words, changing things to a dicastery
you know
reduces their jurisdictional authority.
Yeah, it's sort of, with apologies to George Orwell, you can talk till you're blue in the face about how all dicasteries are juridically equal. But the fact is that some dicasteries will have to be more equal than others if you're gonna,
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm driving at.
you
But
know,
anyway, I don't mean to like be
otherwise a
cutting.
bureaucracy, which is a power structure, cannot be stably functional over time, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It so it's designed, the whole thing is designed not to work.
Yeah.
Is the whole thing my point that I'm driving at? And Kale, I'm going to give you a chance here to ask a question in a second. My point is more cynical. That everything was changed to castery because the Pope had a particular congregation or two whose legs he wanted to cut off. I think, in particular, the CDF. I think he's sick and tired of the church being run by doctrine and theology. I mean, he has said this 100 million times in 100 million different ways. To hell with doctrines, to hell with theology. Praxis is what matters. And I think he got sick and tired of the DDF kind of CDF running things, there. And I think that was one of them, that he wanted to cut off their legs to make them on an equal footing with the congregation in charge of toilets. I think it was vindictive.
Uh, well, but what to say to that?
I'm trying to bait you, Chris. Come on.
Well, look, I don't think there is necessary. I wouldn't, quite put it the way that you did, but I don't think that
You
there's as
would.
much. I don't think that there is as much daylight between our positions on this as it may seem. Um, and let me illustrate it by two examples. One, an alternative view of the effect of the reform and the mind of Francis with respect to the CDF, or the DDF as it's now styled, right?
Yeah.
Um, and the other will come via a look at the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, Propaganda Fide, as we used to call it, right? Or the Dicastery for Evangelization these days. With respect to the DDF, the DDF has always been there. Now, at times, the DDF, or the thing that used to be the CDF, the thing that used to be the Holy Office, right? Um, second half, starting in the second half of the 19th century, and really going back a little bit earlier than that, in the perfectly understandable, but nevertheless, I think rather unfortunate reaction to the collapse of the Ancien Regime and the Franco-Revolutionary and Napoleonic upheavals in Europe. In which the church as an integral part of society began to lose its footing, and caused something of a panic. Again, perfectly understandable. I think in a lot of ways we are still in the church reacting to that and haven't reckoned with it in anything like the way that that we think we have.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother conversation, but let's put it in parentheses and bracket it off for just a minute, right? Certainly, during and in the wake of the modernist crisis, the Holy Office was off the rails. They were going after everybody. They tried to stop Graham Greene from publishing The Power and the Glory. Everybody knows that story, right? And
it's crazy. I think it's important.
It was nuts,
yeah.
right? Now
that was what, 70 years ago, 80 years ago, 90 years ago? When
something
was that?
Yeah. So we're, first half of the 20th century, right?
That's not our praxis now, and it's certainly not our experience post-Vatican II.
The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, especially, everyone talks about Ratzinger being der Gotteshauptweiler, right. But the fact is that JP2 brought him in precisely because he knew that he had been appalled by the politicization of theological faculties in his native Germany. And had retired to the comparative backwater of Regensburg in order to get away from the toxic environment in Tübingen and the issue. The reason he was brought in was that he wasn't going to pull the trigger, right? And everyone says, well, what about Kung? What about Kung? Well, I mean, name me another one. There are a few. There are a couple of dozen names that you could probably pull out, all of whom, or most of whom, unless they made it impossible, didn't have their works destroyed, didn't even have their licenses to teach revoked. The only thing that happened to Kung was that he had to change, take one word, take the word Catholic off the door of his office.
Yeah.
And by the way, it was that whole episode that made Kung, right?
Yeah.
Ratzinger wanted people to be able to argue with one another. And I remember hearing stories about people, who, whose dissertations whose committees he was on, and you always knew how much trouble you were in because it was directly proportional to the amount of time that he spent praising your work, and the more he praised it, the deeper you knew the trouble you were in. That's the kind of guy he was.
Well, that's because he liked to steel man your position before he tore into it.
Right. Now, the CDF exists in order to protect the integrity of Catholic doctrine. That's why it's there. All right. That's what it is supposed to do. It's not supposed to go out hunting monsters. It's supposed to step in when things are brought to its attention and attempts to resolve, to clarify, to otherwise mitigate a lack
Scandal.
of clarity or even
Scandal.
error
Scandal.
have failed,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
That's what it's there to do. Uh, Francis has said that he wants the DDF to promote theological dialogue.
I
All
mean,
right.
honestly,
Which doesn't actually help theological dialogue. It bureaucratizes the whole theological project.
that's interesting.
Kale,
That,
go ahead. You wanted to
yeah,
say
no,
something.
I'm glad I shut up because that I actually, what do you, how does that strike you, Larry? So the
Well, it's
bureaucratization. I mean, that's an interesting take on it.
Well, it strikes me as exactly correct. I share Chris's, I think, beautiful and wonderful definition of what the congregation is for, the CDF was for, now DDF. It's there as a backstop. It's there as a kind of arbitrator, a referee, and usually should only be invoked when there are contentious issues that needed to be resolved, at a level of a higher authority. It certainly should not be out hunting monsters. I love the way you put it, Chris. And there was a time when the CDF was out hunting monsters. In fact, a lot of Ratzinger's friends in his youth, from people like de Lubac and so forth, were one of those so-called monsters that was being hunted. And so, yeah, if all Pope Francis is doing is, in a sense, saying, look, we need to restore this, we need to get rid of this whole holy office of the Inquisition motif and get back to its more minimalist operative functions. That's great. But then to turn around and say we want the DDF to be a promoter of theological dialogue, that immediately in my mind conjures up curated conversations, uh, with favored people invited in to give
Yeah,
talks.
I mean, and
Uh,
again, from my lay perspective, just shared bullshit,
yeah,
right? And it's just like, to me, it's like, it's sort of a minimalist style. It's like, look, ultimately, you're going to ask me, it's either this or that, right? It's like an A/B test at the end of the day, and you only want to invoke A/B testing when you really, really have to, right? And so, to the excesses of monster hunting, I accept, I take it, but then to sort of turn around and promote strange dialogue. Look, and I'm just, it's very difficult for me to hear the word dialogue and just not be very cynical about it, because growing up, in the way that I did, when I heard the word dialogue, it meant a certain specific, it was a smuggled in ideology, right? And so I have a hard time hearing that phrase.
I
I
agree.
guess,
Go
yeah,
ahead, Chris.
if I may, yeah, but the one point that I would be at some pains to emphasize here is that the people who are doing it don't have to be ill-intentioned. Okay. Um,
But they can
take
be.
them. They can be, because people, and our own motives are as opaque to us as they are to, are very often more opaque to us
Mhm.
than they are to others, right? So everything that's one of the reasons I don't like to, to put intentions on trial, but to point to what people are actually doing,
Yeah.
Let me
right?
put it this way,
And
and I don't mean to interrupt. I'm
prosaically,
not calling into question the sincerity of their intentions or motives. I'm calling into question the validity of their intentions and motives. I'm calling them into question the level of prudential judgment. I'm calling them idiots. That's what I'm calling them. Yeah, they might be well intentioned. They're well intentioned buffoons, theological nitwits.
I don't know
Uh,
whether they're well intentioned or not.
yeah.
But um, in these particular regards, but I don't mind saying that it strikes me as evidently lacking in real world savvy, not to realize that if your purpose, let's suppose that the purpose of even something as egregious as Fiducia Supplicans,
I was just going
right?
to bring that up.
was, well, I'm just trying to, I'm trying to start a theological conversation. Well, everybody knows what happens when the boss says, hey, guys, this is just a suggestion. But until we see it,
that is the statement of the evening here, Chris. That's
until
great.
you see it through that lens, and then everybody has a meltdown and thinks that the sky is falling. And no, it's just it's people being dumb.
That's my point. It's just it's more incompetence than evil.
And once you've established that, the rest of it doesn't really matter, right? But
Well, to go back to Kale, just a minute, Chris.
think
Go back
about
to
it like
Kale's
this, all
Kale's
right?
point.
So
Go ahead.
When Predicate Evangelium was rolled out, right? We heard a lot about how the top dog in the Curial pack was now going to be the evangelization dicastery, and all that really meant was that on paper in the new document it was listed ahead of others.
Yeah.
But there again, and it doesn't withstand Francis's own tests, right? Lofty as it sounds, it doesn't take into account what the Curia is, which again is a bureaucracy. To say it with Francis, right? It puts ideas above reality, which is one of his big no-nos. To say it more prosaically, it tries to put a square peg in a round hole.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The Curia is a power structure. And if you make evangelization the goal of the Curia, you're not going to make the Curia fit for ecclesial purpose. You're going to bureaucratize the church's whole missionary mandate.
Mm.
It's the same criticism as I made to DDF applied to prop fide. It
Yeah. So let me ask you this. Kale said earlier, about how the word dialogue immediately sort of sets him on edge, and I agree. And the reason is that dialogue always just seems to be code for let's hold this question open until the progressives can get their way, and then we'll close the conversation. We'll talk it to death, talk it to death, talk it to death, and then when we get the progressive position in line, then we'll nail that coffin in place. And I think the perfect example of this, you can talk dialogue till you're blue in the face. Where was the dialogue with Fiducia Supplicans? Where?
Mm-hmm.
We had just finished. The Fiducia came out like what? 10 days, 1 week after the ending of the first synod on synodality in October of 2023, in which one of the burning issues was how does the church minister to homosexuals? And much debate and back and forth. And then the final document ended up not saying hardly anything at all about the issue, which really pissed off a lot of people who thought it was an important issue to talk about. And everyone that says, well, we got another synod coming up in a year, let's deal with it then. And then whammo, like a skyhook Roman deus ex machina, out comes Fiducia Supplicans. No dialogue, no conversation, no synodality, just boom, here's our decision. Dialogue? I don't think so. What about Traditionis Custodes?
Right,
Where was the dialogue in that regard? No, it's like you indiatrist, backwardist scoundrels. We're not going to listen to anything that you have to say. We're not going to listen to one word that you have to say. In fact, we're now, Cardinal Supich, don't kneel, stand up. All right. We're going to actually put you in your place. That's why Kale and I don't trust when Pope Francis says dialogue, dialogue. It's just code for some other nonsense. Kale, go ahead.
Yeah, well, you put it well, and I'm struck in this conversation. You've invoked some things that as someone who watches this stuff pretty closely, I honestly, like in a weird sort of, I had forgotten about Supplicans until you brought it up.
Well, it's a dead letter,
but it's interesting, right? No, I know, I take your point, Chris. But it's like there's just this weird fatigue of like, what is this? What does any of this stuff even matter? Which I can't believe I've come to. As someone who, who sort of kind of came back into the swing of things in the early 90s, as a late or as an early college student. I kind of lived and breathed this stuff, and this was sort of in the last half of JP2, and all that. And I can't believe that that the Vatican could come out with something, a year and change ago, as wild as Fiducia Supplicans. And like I forgot about it a year later.
Well, there, I think we have to recognize, Kale, that we are all of us in, well beyond the saturation, the information saturation
Okay.
point.
Yeah,
That's a great point, Chris.
And
Yeah.
the outrage machine
hmm
uh just churns it out.
Sure.
Um,
That's fair. That's fair.
you know,
But
um,
but just to add a little something to that, I don't disagree with that. The sort of the fire hose of data, right? Just information. Point taken. But in a weird sort of way, something as potentially monumental as Fiducia Supplicans, right? No clarification offered. We remember that. No real clarification offered in the aftermath. Sort
yeah,
of.
no real clear. That's an important qualification. No clarification worth the name. There was some
Right, 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 right.
there was some hemming and hawing that came from
Fernandez.
Fernandez.
Yeah.
Right. But it has then
And
turned,
Francis said a few things too, which didn't quite
but
track with
right,
the
but it was like
record.
he said something one way and then kind of said something another way.
Par for the course.
Right, of course, of course, par for the course. And so it's gotten me to think. Somebody put a picture up on the Twitter the other day of Supich McElroy, um, and Supich McElroy
Oban.
and Tobin, meeting with the Pope. And I was looking at that picture for a few minutes, and whatever, somebody made kind of whatever a joke. I was looking at those two guys, those four guys, and these are big deal. Like these are, it's kind of a big deal, that picture, right? And
Yeah.
I'm sitting there thinking, like, they're just totally irrelevant. In one way. I mean, yes, they're powerful members of the church, super, again, but like I'm just kind of looking at that picture and being like, it just kind of doesn't even matter. It's weird. Have I just become broken by this whole thing?
No, years ago I think the first line of my book. What was my book called, Larry? The one on reading the church without losing your faith.
That's it.
Um,
It's somewhere on
uh,
this shelf back here.
it's a thin volume. Pick it up. It's CTS. It's you can get it on the cheap, and it's a good read if I do say so myself.
Actually,
Um,
it's excellent. It's an excellent book.
but I mean, I start out telling a story about how I had a friend on the line, a dear friend of many years, who was all worked up over something or other, and I didn't remember when I wrote the chapter, and I don't
Yeah.
remember now what particular thing it was. It doesn't matter. And my advice was, look, if you don't get paid to read the Vatican pages, don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and as my friend Kevin Clay, who is a follower of this blog, often said to me, the trouble with popes is that they die. That's also, the blessing with regard to popes is that they die. And what he meant by the trouble with popes that they die is that a pope, these things can seem terribly important while the pontiff is reigning. But as soon as he's not dead 5 seconds, and the speculation's already beginning on the next one and what
Right.
policies he might overturn. And so I always said, this too shall pass. Right, Chris?
This too shall pass. That's correct.
I was hoping to solicit some further comment from you as to the passing nature of popes and whether or not we should take any of this all that seriously.
Well, I mean the the Roman maxim, right?
Well, which one?
Mortum papas in van art.
Translation?
Roman dialect for when one pope dies, you make another.
That's right. That's right.
Um,
Well,
it is now. I will say that uh, there has been what one of the hallmarks of the Francis pontificate, and my good friend Andrea Gagliarducci, the excellent
yeah, you post his
Vatican
stuff all the
watcher,
time. Yeah, you post his stuff a lot. Yeah.
who is an Italian and writes mostly in Italian. I share some of his English language stuff, which some of which he does also with and for CNA, um, and for a couple of other affiliate outlets. But he blogs on his own dime too, and I like reading that one, especially since it's one of the conceits of his Monday Vatican blog is that he writes it largely in sort of almost transliterated Italian, which is a clue to the reader that you know read this
Yeah.
in an Italian idiom and analytical key, right? Which is very different. The spaces between the lines and the way that one needs to read between them is very much different. But he's been big on the point that uh, Francis's penchant for personal rule is itself something that Francis has sought to institutionalize. Um, and that in his efforts to make his reforms, such as they have been, permanent, he is really attempting to remake the papal office as one of personal rule in a way that it hasn't been in a very, very long time, if ever. Certainly hasn't ever been in the modern age, right? There have been autocratic
Yeah.
popes.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean when you say he's trying to make his rule personal rather than institutional? And now he's trying to
No, it's
institutionalize that personal dimension.
well, personal rule is just a way to say that the natural person who holds the office and exercises the power of the juridical person uh have primary importance when it comes to policy, decision making, execution, et cetera, et cetera. Um,
But isn't that true of all popes?
I wouldn't think so.
Hmm.
There have been popes who have been very content to
Okay,
rule
yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
through the ordinary organs of power. Not nobody in recent memory has spoken as much or given or expected that as much weight be given to his personal opinions and
Yeah, I see.
preferences.
This is what I was driving at. That's what I thought you meant, and that's
You
why I
mean
wanted to.
like
Yeah,
his manifest will, you mean? Or
yeah. Well, you see that. I mean, the Pope Francis now has another autobiography out, which really isn't an autobiography at all, just more like an interview. And I mean, it just seems like every time you turn around, we're getting armchair opinions on this, that, and the other thing from Pope. I can never remember a Pope for whom airplane conversations were so important.
could argue they're the most important thing.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not going to complain. He's great for copy.
Yeah, that's
Um,
true. But more just what I mean by that. I mean, right at the very beginning of his papacy, he's on the airplane, and the issue of, gay priest comes up and he says, well,
Who am I to
who
judge?
am I to judge? Now that had a context with regard to a very particular person who had
Doesn't
apparently
matter.
reformed and repented and so on. And yet that statement then went out over the airwaves. All right. Well, Pope says, who am I to judge with regard to gay priests? And that takes on a life of its own, and the Vatican never corrected it, never took it back, never said, "Hey, well, wait a minute. Here's what the Pope
well,
really meant by that." So I think this is kind of what you're talking about, Chris. The
but
Pope, I think, sort of enjoys this. Go ahead.
on that point, I mean, you can agree, and I do agree with the idea that, yeah, if the guy's had a conversion, that's fantastic. It's a win for Jesus, and we're all happy.
Yeah.
All right. Um, but it doesn't mean that a guy with that sort of personal history should be given a sensitive job inside,
Yeah.
the church's central governing apparatus.
Yeah.
And that was what the real story there was, right? I mean, and the analogy that I like to draw in the case of the fellow was Monsignor Battista Ricca. Um, you know, it was a story when General Petraeus had an extramarital affair.
Yeah.
And it was a story, not only or even primarily because affairs are, crimes under the Universal Code of Military Justice.
Mhm.
It's the reason they're crimes under the Universal Code of Military Justice is because they're security leaks.
Yep.
Quite.
And wasn't he having
It's
an
not
affair
only or
with a subordinate?
but
Was
it's
a
all.
subordinate?
No, it was with his
His
biographer.
biographer.
Oh, okay.
Um, but the point is, Larry, that a general carrying on with a woman who's not his wife makes that general a mark for all sorts of bad actors.
Well, like
Yes.
JFK sleeping with East German spy ladies.
Yeah. Samizdat. I mean, that's what it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
The
No, I get the point. I want to move on though, because we're really running long
but in the
here.
case of a guy, yeah, that and
I want to go.
there's yeah, go ahead, move us along because
Yeah,
there's
because
I could.
I gotta go here in about 15 minutes or so. So I actually have goats and sheep I have to take care of. I was doing that before we went on, and I didn't finish. So I got to go back out. We're about to go to about 9 million degrees below zero here, so I have some things that I have to do now.
Yeah, I think we're at it's a balmy 22 degrees here in
Yeah, it's
my.
about 15 here right now. But anyway, I want to come back to we would be remiss if we didn't tie this up neatly by ending with a conversation about Father Rupnik. You've written several, maybe six, seven, eight, nine articles on the L'Affaire Rupnik,
Mhm.
and what it tells us
Oh,
about this
I think it's
papacy.
a lot more, double that. Yeah, but
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm talking just the ones I saw in Catholical Report, which was, scratching the surface of everything. And so you probably are the reporter, journalist who's been most in the English speaking world anyway,
Yeah.
who's been most on top of this story. So, in light of the past hour and 20 minutes we've been talking, in light of this whole conversation, what the hell's going on with the Rupnik affair? Let's just put it that way.
oof, wouldn't I like
Oof,
to know?
oof,
But,
oofa.
it is an utterly sordid mess. Impossibly awful. Uh, and we don't appear to be any closer to resolution today than we were 6 months ago, or even a year ago when we heard from then Monsignor John Kennedy that, oh yeah, we've begun to look at this, and it's a delicate matter is one of the things that he said. I want to, uh
Yeah.
misquote him, but the gist of it was there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of considerations, among them the impact that this is going to have on the church and on churchmen and what have you. And it was really it was disheartening to me because I I want the one concern of the church in this case to be securing justice for
The victims.
for the victims and for Rupnik, and for the faithful. Justice is a public good.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say that. Go ahead.
And it is impossible right now to trust the church at the highest levels of government with one of the chief ends of government, which is the administration of justice. The man is still a priest in good standing.
Yeah. Amazing.
Uh,
Didn't he absolve
is
in the confessional a woman of a sexual sin that he had committed with her?
Yes, the legal jargon is an accomplice in a sin against the sixth commandment. Now, the sin itself may or may not have been criminal, but the absolution certainly was a crime reserved. It was one of the gravest of the grave crimes at canon law. It was investigated and tried in secret. The verdict was kept secret. He was excommunicated, and then the excommunication was lifted almost as soon as it was imposed. And, he incurred the excommunication late sententia, which is to say in the commission of the act itself. And the court that tried it declared the excommunication. But then the competent offices in the Vatican removed the excommunication, as they should have done, by the way, as soon as he expressed any remorse. It's a medicinal penalty. That's the way it's set up. Now, so lots of people have made lots of hay about, well, why was the excommunication lifted so quickly? That doesn't bother me really at all. Mm-hmm. What bothers me is that the whole business was kept secret. What bothers me is that very shortly after that, the CDF decided, oh, no, these crimes are, beyond the statute of limitation. And whether Francis actively approved or directed that, or whether he simply acquiesced to it and didn't do anything, people, what did Francis do? Well, maybe he did nothing, because nothing is all he had to do in order to make sure that Rupnik never faced justice for his acts. Now, statutes of limitations have a very good reason for existing. They're there to protect the integrity of judicial processes, to make sure that the accused have the ability to confront witnesses, to examine evidence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? In this case, there was mountainous evidence and ample ability for the accused to confront witnesses. The accused himself was alive and in very good health. And only a few months to, no more than a year and a half before he would have faced trial, they were able to conduct a secret trial and convict him. But now all of a sudden, these are statute barred? No, it doesn't. It doesn't pass the smell test. There's no universe in which a reasonable explanation of that decision is forthcoming. And no attempt has been made to offer one. Remember, then, it was only in the wake of incandescent global outrage that Francis decided to reopen the case. And that outrage only came when it got out that he was still a priest in good standing, and after having been expelled from the Jesuits, had been incarnated in a diocese in his native Slovenia,
where a lot of the crimes had been
where
committed.
where the earliest record of alleged crimes had been committed, in connection with a religious
Religious
congregation that
order,
he had
yeah,
helped to found. Yeah. A women religious, by the way. Most of his
yeah,
victims are women religious.
yeah,
And his artwork still adorns shrines and chapels, and oratories, and other holy spaces throughout the pilgrimage sites, throughout the world. And I'm not talking about backwaters either. I'm talking about Lourdes and Fatima.
Yep.
He did a whole
yeah.
chapel dedicated to Our Lady inside the Apostolic Palace. That was back in the 90s under JP2,
The
where his rise.
JP2
So,
shrine
so,
in Washington D.C. is
DC,
festooned.
although the
Knights of Columbus.
Knights have
Removed it.
have uh certainly covered up, and I mean covered the artwork, and I believe, although you'll have to check me on this,
Okay,
are
so
taking steps to remove and
right,
dismantle,
two
and this
things.
isn't about iconoclasm destroying, the works of art as works of art may very well be able to be judged on their merits. Now, I don't happen to think very much of them at all, but that's me. What the question here is whether they are fit for sacred space,
Right.
and
Right,
the
right.
answer there has to be no, because his so-called creative process, and I'm doing scare quotes for those of you who are listening to this, involved the abuse of his victims.
Right.
And the abuse of his victims was wrapped up in his so-called creative process. The whole thing is tainted at that point. And, there's been, not only has there been no acknowledgement of this, but we've seen a full-throated defense of Rupnik and his art from the head of the Vatican's communications dicastery, who, by the way, is still in his job.
Yeah, and it's crazy.
The whole thing, every detail, every development in this story is more appalling than the last.
So the question becomes this, okay? He's obviously getting special treatment. Kale and Chris and I, well, we all of us probably know cases here in the United States of a priest that gets accused of sexual abuse or whatever, and then immediately gets placed on a, leave
Yeah.
of absence, suspended from ministry, pending an investigation. I've known of instances of priests that reside in limbo for 1 year, 2 years, sometimes 3 years before they're exonerated, and then finally return to ministry. And by the way, oh yeah, sorry, yeah, now you can go back
Sorry
to
about all
ministry.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, so that can take years, from one accusation. And here we have all of these multiple accusations. This guy is, boom, he's right back in ministry. So the question then, I have a couple of questions. Number one, is he getting special treatment because he's a Jesuit? And number two, because he's a Jesuit, does he know the Pope? Is he friends with the Pope? Is he therefore getting special treatment simply because, once again, this Pope has decided, hey, I'm going to exercise my authority to rehabilitate somebody that's a friend of mine?
So he does know the Pope. He knows Pope Francis. He knew Benedict. He knew JP2. Francis has shown him significant favor and a measure of confidence, um, including inviting, him to, and whether the invitation came from Francis personally is something that has yet to be established, but he gave the 2020 Lenten retreat
Yeah.
in Father Cantalamesa's stead, or Cardinal Cantalamesa's stead. Maybe he was still Father Cantalamesa. I don't remember when he got his red hat. Anyway, it was Ronatide. Everything was a mess. That was somewhat the timing on that is awfully, it makes one go,
Yeah.
right? Because it was right around the time that he had been convicted, and before the secret tribunal had decided exactly what secret penalty to impose and then lift. It was without the timeline actually open in front of me, I would not want to nail myself down on
Okay.
any of the exact dates, but that was all going on in that the time
No,
frame.
but
But you asked about the Jesuits, and one must say that it was a Jesuit who was also an auxiliary of the Rome diocese, Bishop Libanori, whose last name is S.J., who went to investigate the congregation that and accusations of bad leadership and bad action on the part of Sister Ivanka Hosta, who had co-founded the congregation, and he brought back allegations to Rome, and he has been dogged. The Jesuits themselves have conducted their own investigations, and have not been, they haven't sat quiet or sat still.
no, I'm not here.
Father Sosa, the Jesuit general, is not
No, I'm not accusing the Jesuits of covering up anything or
acquitted
moving slow.
himself
What I'm saying is this. I'm saying Pope Francis. Pope Francis has intervened and soft pedaled this whole thing because Rupnik was a Jesuit. That's my not that the Jesuits have sort of fumbled this, but Pope Francis has a soft spot in his heart for Rupnik because Rupnik's an ex-Jesuit. That's my question to you, and there's no way you can probably even know that. But I want to bring this to an even finer point because you've also reported on this, Chris. This is not the only time that the Pope has turned a blind eye to somebody who's been accused of sexual abuse and
Right.
rehabilitated them, right?
No, it's not. Unfortunately, that has to be said. Or it certainly uh, is the case. And it's not only turning a blind eye in some cases, it's actively believing
Right.
the word of the bad actor over the evidence of victim testimony, and sometimes of his own senses. Um, the most egregious case involving a bishop, it could be, and the one certainly that touches Francis most closely, is the case of Bishop Zanchetta.
Right.
That's yeah, exactly. That's what I had
Right,
in
but he's
mind.
not the only one.
Yeah, one of
And
several.
why did Cardinal Ricard keep his red hat when he confessed to
Yeah,
molesting a
yeah,
child?
yeah, yeah.
There is no
Why
explanation.
the favoritism showed towards Gottfried Daniels, who clearly on tape pressured his what nephew to not
Nephew. Yeah.
yeah to not report on a priest that had molested him.
On a bishop.
Yeah, oh yeah, a bishop. Yeah. So, and all of a sudden Daniel.
It was not Daniel's nephew. It was the bishop's own. It was
Oh,
uh,
okay. Yeah, somebody's nephew. I thought it was Daniel's nephew, but it wasn't. It was the
no.
bishop's nephew. That's right.
And that fellow Roger Vangaloya was a very bad actor. Uh, and
Yeah. And once again, not questioning motives or whatever, but it's very clear Daniels was of that generation of prelates who thought, well, the best way to deal with this is to get people to shut up, to
And
just keep things.
he was on the loggia with
Yes, he
Francis
was.
when he was
Bergoglio.
elected,
Yeah, that's right.
and
Well,
he
supposedly the
was
Saint Gallen Mafia and all that stuff. I don't
invited
know.
to participate in the Synod on the Family.
Yeah,
Of all of the things to invite a fellow like that
on
to
the
participate
family.
in, yeah, I
All right.
just I don't
Well, gentlemen, I have to go here very soon, but Kale, you've been
can we
quietly.
not wrap up on that
No, we're
note?
not. That's why I'm turning to Kale now
Oh
and say,
no.
I'm going to turn to Kale and say, okay, we've dealt with the sordid.
Mhm.
Now, maybe Kale has some final thoughts or a direction that maybe we can go in here at the end.
Well, look, I take Chris's point, the sort of the dry, gallows humor of the Roman, quip, right? Popes die and we make new ones. And I take a certain amount of solace in that for what it's worth, and again, I'm not trying to be a jerk here, but man, you lay these kind of things out and you're like, man, we have just, it's been a long time. And it struck me as we were talking too, I asked you earlier, Chris, when we all seem to be kind of waiting around for like the next chapter, and we're sort of just in this sort of holding pattern. And if you look at the last several, pontificates, it's like, well, Benedict didn't have this, right? Because he resigned. John Paul II had such a spectacularly long and lengthy pontificate, but also a pretty long dying. He died for, again, I don't want to be, what, six,
Four or
seven, eight
five
years?
years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
No, more, yeah, 6, 7, 8,
it's
10.
more
Like
like six, 7, or 8.
the last 10 years of
Right.
his,
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
1995 to 2005, he was in, evident and progressive decline.
Yeah, so and then prior to that we've got the month of JP1, and then you've got the whatever the 15, what is it, about 15 years of Paul VI. It's almost like we've sort of forgotten you know how these transitions kind of occur. So I wonder if you know, I mean, who knows? I mean, 2025 is already proving itself to be, quite a transition type year. So, I do sense this will be upon us soon enough. But I hope that the church will spend a little time in introspection, or at least the College of Cardinals will spend a little bit of time of genuine prayer, like as if prayer matters. I just want them to try that out. Some genuine prayer and discernment about what the church might need in the aftermath of Francis's pontificate. And and part of me is just wants it's actually not that hard. It's actually not that hard. In this sense, just be clear, be the sign of contradiction that you have been for a very, very long time. Be a happy warrior about this. There's no need to kind of, you're never going to be cool, so stop trying to be cool. And just go back to the business of witnessing to the power and the glory of Jesus Christ. And all this stuff that happens all the time, it's like watching people make traps that they fall in, that they will then trap themselves into over and over and over again. And I don't know, it just seems like a 12 years, 13 years of just self-inflicted wound after self-inflicted wound. And I hope that we will stop this business. I really do.
Comment,
Um,
Chris?
I'm into that. I think that we have had a very much longer and harder road and go of bringing the office of the papacy
Mhm, mhm.
into uh, modernity, than I think we've ever really been willing to warrant or even allow.
Yeah.
And it's a problem. Um, you know, uh, Do I want a pope who is going to teach and preach and witness in his sanctity of life to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and the truth of his church? Yes, obviously.
Mhm.
I I hope that we are going to get someone who is a halfway competent governor.
Yeah.
Um, and that's easier said than done. The cardinals who are going to pick the next guy have their work cut out for them, and there aren't even, I don't think, the usual factions going
Yeah,
in,
I agree.
right? Um, so it's a tough race to handicap for that very reason. Um,
Yeah.
but
Well, yeah. I suppose whoever it is simply adopts the medical code. First, do no harm. That's
that,
first, do no harm,
that's
because
easier said than done too, right? I
yeah,
mean,
exactly.
and the easiest way to do that is or to attempt that is to really do very little.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what is needed. I don't know. Um,
Well,
but we're gonna see.
maybe,
You know,
after
the
25 years of JP2, 8 years of Benedict, now 11, 12 years, whatever it is, of Francis, and numerous encyclicals and world travel stuff, maybe it's time for the papacy actually to simply step back, take a deep breath, and say, whoever the next pope is, I'm not going to issue a single encyclical or apostolic exhortation. I'm not going to go on any trips. I'm just going to stay at home and I'm going to run this thing called the Apostolic See, the Catholic Church, and we're going to go from there. You know, that to me would be the ideal next pope.
Careful what you wish for is the only thing I would say.
Yeah,
But it's interesting times, and they're only going to get interestinger. Um,
yeah. Well, my point is this, to go back to Kevin
now,
Clay's
it
comment
if
about,
I could though, and I
yeah.
think I've said this before on your show, Larry, but so apologies to regular listeners, but the bark of Peter will come safely to port is a certainty of faith.
Yeah.
What condition the bark is in when she finally does call, well, all bets are off on that. And how well or how poorly she is being governed while she is underway, we've no guarantee in that sense either. So stay tuned.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think there's still so much of the legacy of the past several popes to digest that we need to digest it. To go back to Kevin Clay's statement, the trouble with popes is that they die, is that I truly believe that the teaching pontificate of John Paul II has left us with an unbelievable theological, intellectual, and teaching legacy that we have barely begun to even scratch the surface of and to appropriate as a church. And then all of a sudden, we've just sort of breathlessly moved on from that. It's like, yeah. JP2, he was so yesterday. And now we've got Fiducia Supplicans and we've got all this other stuff. And we've got dialogue and synodality. So Veritatis Splendor, yeah, that's yesterday's papacy, and this is the attitude that I think we have to set aside. Not all encyclicals are equal, but I think the intellectual theological legacy of JP2 and Benedict is something we need to pause, take a deep breath, look back upon, and say, you know what? That is worth paying attention to. And that's what I mean when I say I hope the next pope doesn't write in the sense that I hope the next pope
Yeah.
is more of a retrospective pope who says, let's take a deep breath and take a look at what Paul VI, JP2, Benedict, and Francis have bequeathed to us in the light of the council, and let's talk about that. That would be my approach to things. But anyway, I really, 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 really gotta go, guys.
Yeah,
So,
you're
Chris,
you're
I
running
hope
out of daylight, huh?
Yeah.
I'm running out of daylight. There are things I gotta do before the big Siberian Express hits us tonight.
Yeah.
And I can't thank you guys enough. Chris, I apologize in advance if I said anything too provocative that, got you into trouble or anything. But
No, yeah, I own every syllable of what I say, and I ain't responsible for what you say, Larry.
no, thank God nobody is. Kale, thank you as always, sir.
Pleasure, man. Pleasure, guys.
I wish I'd given you more opportunity to speak
Nah,
instead of
you're
me
good.
jabbering on. But anyway,
Love it.
hey, thanks
Kale,
everybody.
actually, is there a way for you to hang on for a second? Do you have a couple of minutes?
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, okay, great. All right. Well, hmm, I have
So,
to end this meeting in
yeah,
order
go
for
ahead.
it to start
Yeah, go ahead.
processing.
I'll get to you, Chris. Just stay put on your computer.